In this video, we're going to cover RESTful principals and APIs. There are very few RESTful applications, fully RESTful applications, out in the wild. There are various applications that will implement REST to one degree or another. This particular application is it's a template application that was built to build other applications on top of, and it was built with REST in mind, and because it's a template, it needs to be pretty close to a fully RESTful application. So we'll use this application for the demonstration. REST embraces HTTP as it was originally envisioned. HTTP has methods, it has status codes for return values, it has various HTTP headers to control things like the format of the data that's returned, the encoding of the data that should be returned, and various methods like get and put and post to manipulate data. So with that in mind, there are four primary actions or HTTP methods. There is post, get, put, and delete. In addition to that, there's a fifth action that is rarely used but is used in some circumstances, and that method is patch. The purposes of these four HTTP methods are as follows. A post creates an entity. A get will read an entity or get an entity. A put updates an entity. And a delete obviously deletes an entity. Now you notice by putting these in this specific order, we end up with a term that's very common in business contexts called a CRUD app. So CRUD standing for create, read, update, and delete. Patch is a little bit unique because it also does an update, but it does a partial update of an entity that you're looking at, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. However, you can effect a change on a specific property value of an object, for instance, by using patch. This enables certain use cases. What we typically do in, say, an ASP.NET MVC application is create an action method to make some sort of business change, like make an administrator. With patch, I can say I want to set the isAdministrator flag to true for this user, and the need for a specific action method to make somebody an administrator now goes away because I can just change the data. So with REST, we really talk about data as a first-class object rather than thinking about various methods. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about things as we interact with the system. This also allows a very standard way of making updates and reading various values from a system, and that makes things more consistent throughout the internet as we work with various systems. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to start by using this application, and we've got a number of various entities that we can interact with this application. One of those entities is a role. So what we'll do here is start with jQuery method called getJSON. And we're using this because we want to get a JSON property. By default, a browser will ask for HTML using a HTTP header called the accept header. It will say, I'll take HTML or whatever you happen to be able to give to me. In this case, we want to override that accept header and say, no, what we really want is JSON, and only if you don't have a JSON format available, give me something else. So we will ask for roles from the system. And you'll notice that the I'm using the plural roles. This is a little bit different from a standard ASP.NET MVC because the convention in ASP.NET MVC is to use a singular controller name. So you would have something like role controller. The standard or the convention that is more or less embraced on the internet is to use plurals. So this particular application has been changed such that plurals are allowed to match the conventions that are out on the internet. But we could also do template/role. By using template/roles and just hitting this particular endpoint, rather than asking for a specific ID, I'm going to be asking for all the roles that exist in the system. So once I get back the data, I will log the data to the console. And you'll notice at this point I get an error. So we'll look at the network tab here, and we'll see that this says I did a get, and the response that I got back was retry with authentication. This particular application works again just slightly differently in that most REST APIs that are out there will return back a HTTP status code of 401. In this application, because it has to interact with IIS, returning back an HTTP status code of 401 triggers IIS to add another HTTP header, which in turn instructs the browser to prompt the user with a dialog box of username and password. We don't want to do that, so in this case, the status code returned is a 449. The only way to override that IIS behavior is to reconfigure IIS specifically, and for one of the design goals for this application was to not require any kind of reconfiguration of IIS for deployment. So all it's really asking us is to log in, which we will do here. And once I'm logged in, I will retry my request. And at this point, I have a get 200 OK, and I've been returned JSON, which is exactly what I want. Down here, we'll see, here's our object. Now you'll notice that the items that are in the object are not just returned directly with an array, but we're wrapping that inside of an object. And the reason that we do that, there's two reasons. One is that an array returning an array from the server introduces a relatively obscure but very real security concern with possible script injection. The other reason for that is that this server, this method of doing things lends itself well to paging functionality. So with query string arguments on template/roles, I could ask for a specific page of records, or I want to start at a certain point in time. There's no real standard as far as query string arguments go, at least at the moment in July of 2013. Although Microsoft is trying with their OData standard to have a specific set of query string arguments that would be standard across all applications. But this is one way that we would do searching, is by asking for an entity and then providing search values. There are also RESTful APIs that are also considered RESTful that have a specific search endpoint that allow you to search for various entities. And it's just a design decision that needs to be made when you're constructing your project. There are trade-offs involved either way, and you just have to weigh that and move forward. But with the query string arguments, we could provide filtering capabilities or searching capabilities on our roles entity. Another thing that we'll notice here is that even when I logged in, you'll notice that that when I hit the sign-in button, we saw XML HTTP request here that went to the authentication token and asked for us to create, using the post method, we're creating an authentication token, and we're passing in the username and password in order to validate ourselves. So when it came back with a 200 OK, it means that we have been able to create the token. In this case, that's just a cookie. So now that we're authenticated, we've gotten our roles. The next thing that we would likely need to do, since we only have one role, is we'll create another one. And again, we'll do that by posting, as HTTP method of post will create. I'll use the low-level AJAX form of posting of XML HTTP request within jQuery, and that gives us a lot of control over exactly what will go over the wire. So our URL here, as you can probably guess, will be /template/roles. So on the roles collection, in RESTful terminology, that would be a collection endpoint. I want to create an entity on that collection. So URL roles will have a type of post. We'll specify our data type, and this is the return data type that we're looking for. This data type in the jQuery AJAX API will change the HTTP accept header. So I'll specify this as JSON, and I will set my data to the role that I want to use. So we will say data name REST created role, and description is basic REST operations. And I believe that I've got everything in here, so I will say after that is done, then give me the data and output that data to the console. Okay. So now I've created my role, and the server has returned that role to me so that I can see it directly. The server is creating the ID for me, so it's very useful in RESTful APIs from an API designer perspective to have the return values not just say 200 OK, but also return back a representation of what it was asked to do. So you'll see here we have an HTTP method of post, get a return value of 200 OK, and we're returning back JSON data. And here's my data. So we've got our ID, our name is REST created role, our description is basic REST operations. Now that we've created it with post, there's a good chance that later on we might need to update that data. The way we update that data, again, put. So we'll change this over to put. We'll say that this is a basic REST operation of put update. And now, instead of looking at the whole collection, we're only interested in that particular item. So we'll take this ID and we'll append it to the end that says, I don't want just the roles, any old role, but I want this specific. So now I could do roles, or I could do role for this application. Most REST APIs on the internet use the plural at all times. This particular application has the ability to do plural or singular. So just for completeness, I'll add in the singular version. I think that makes a lot more sense, just as you're reading it, to say that I'm looking at this particular role. I'll do my put, 200 OK, and my object appears down here as we would expect. There's my put with an update. I can go back and I can now read the entire roles collection. I'll see that the role that I've been manipulating is actually in the collection at this point. We see that we have records 2. And we can drill into the array and see there's my REST created role, add a put. I'll come back up here and say, instead of just updating the entire item, I want to just patch it, because I'm not really changing the name, I just am interested in changing the description. And we'll just change all of this. Patch demonstration. Okay. Here's my patch, 200 OK. My object returned, and now I can see that the patch demonstration update is there. My name has stayed the same. Lastly, we'll go ahead and delete this data. We don't actually need to specify any data at all. So we'll take that out. And we'll say that we want to delete. And this is interesting from an API designer perspective. The return value for delete, in this case, it was chosen to just output the object that it was deleting. There's a couple different options here. You could just return nothing, just a 200 OK. You could return the role collection at this point, although in my opinion, returning the role collection might be sending too much data over the wire, depending on how many roles you might have in the system. So I thought that the most consistent way of returning data would be to return a specific item. So now we've covered all the items. We can go back, or all the data manipulations. We can go back to our roles collection, and in fact I can leave that off and just make it singular. Change that to a get, and we'll see now that we've deleted it, we only have one record. That item is my administrative role, which I started out with. So we've covered all the different ways that you can manipulate data with REST. I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much.